Singers, Book 1, Chapters 7 and 8. Read by New York Times bestseller Tamara Rose Blodgett. Chapter 7, Graduation. It was cool, the air holding none of the heat that would be found in other parts of America. Here at latitude 59, late May meant maybe 60 degrees, maybe. Today it was a cool 58. Intermittent clouds floated overhead, and the breeze from the Homer Spit had made its way to the high school, slowed, but not beaten. Julia looked away from the valedictorian who was expounding on the benefits of altruistic endeavors. It was all bullshit, said through the bullhorn of what she could gain by making a good impression on whoever was listening. Julia swung her leg restlessly until Jason stilled it with a hand on her knee. His eyes swung to hers. It'll be okay. Just today, then we're free. The girl droned on. The guys got a fine sheen of sweat over their brows. All that satiny polyester was causing the greenhouse effect. Finally, the staff herded them through the line, and they shook hands, stood for pictures, and ate the celebratory cake courtesy of Costco. It was anticlimactic anyway. It only served to underscore that uneasy feeling Julia had, like she was waiting ever since the Terrell incident. Death, she corrected herself. She had felt a portent, a feeling of impending doom. It felt like a ticking time bomb. Her sleep was leaving her these days, and nightmares were taking up residence in its absence. Julia was exhausted, and Jason was worried. If that weren't enough, there was the impending trial. If a jury of Jason's peers found him not guilty in the death of Terrell, then he was free. Unfortunately, because of the nature of how he had killed Terrell, Jason had a mandatory 6 weeks of anger management classes, and of course, he was angry about the classes. Total irony. The Caldwells had not really forgiven Jason for making them look bad by killing Terrell. Even Truman had defended Jason, saying he'd saved lives. Of course, what the Caldwells weren't telling Truman was that her life was not that important to them. It hurt, but Julia had to stay focused on her future with Jason. When the lame reception was over, they drove to Julia's house so she could change. Then it was out to the beach with Kevin and Sin. Julia opened the door, Jason behind her. He'd been so quiet in the car. She knew something was on his mind. Seeing that Lily wasn't home from work yet, Julia walked to her room. Tearing open her closet door, she chucked out her beach jeans, t-shirt, and the faded, battered, Salty Dog Saloon hoodie. It was her most beat up, but she loved it. She'd bribed a tourist one summer to go in there and get one for her. It was a Homer landmark, a cabin from 1897 that had grown into a rough and tumble tavern. She pressed the hoodie against her face, inhaling the fragrant soap Lily used, and a pang of homesickness struck her. She was really going, she thought, a little forlorn. Just 6 short weeks. Jason came up from behind and wrapped his arms around Julia, the graduation gowns wrapping and mingling together around their legs. It's not like she's gonna die. You can come back and visit her, Jules. Julia nodded. She understood that. She did. But there would be no one. No family to see her get married. No one to appreciate her husband. Just Lily. And Lily was bitter. She had gotten saddled with her brother's kid, and that had been a stain on her heart, spreading across that muscle that throbbed in her body with increasing speed, until all of it was covered in her resentment. Jason kissed Julia's temples, his lips hovering above her skin like butterfly wings, fragile but present. Julia leaned back against him, and he turned her slowly, lifted the gown off, the rasping of the satin catching on the fine strands of hair that had escaped the clasp she'd secured it in. He tossed it aside and tore his own gown off, tossing it on the floor at his feet. Gathering Julia in his arms, he kissed her, pressing his lips to hers with heat. Jason's mouth moved over hers with pressure and longing, combining in a succulent pull. Julia's mouth opened and her arms slid around his broad shoulders, the muscles bunching as he pressed her closer. She gave a little moan and he moved them backward, where they fell softly on her bed. Jason broke the kiss when they landed, elbows braced on either side of her body. "I can't wait to make you mine, Julia," he said, dipping to kiss her temple again. His lips slid from that point, making a blazing trail down her jaw, then a sideways path to her mouth. Jason lingered there, scooping her long hair from where it was pinned underneath, fanning it around her. He slid her further on the bed, falling to the side of her. Jason cupped Julia's face and pecked her lips again. Searching her expression, he saw the lingering anxiety there. "Lily'll come around, you'll see." "She may not, but even though she took me in and saved me from the system, it wasn't really her choice." Speak of the devil. Julia heard Lily buzz into the house and start clanking around in the kitchen. Supper preparation. Julia wasn't that interested. Eating hadn't been a big priority since Terrell. She'd never been an emotional eater. When stuff got intense, food lost its appeal. "Come on," Jason kissed her again, then kissed Julie once more on that tender spot between her earlobe and her collarbone. She smiled, a little breathless. Julia knew some guys would have been trying to attack the obvious, but not Jason. He really loved her. He wanted her, but he wanted her for the right reasons. Jason was the man for her. But in the end, she didn't get him after all. Later. Right away, Julia knew she should have worn a puffy or the top of her hoodie. She sighed. Stepping out of Jason's big truck, the lift kit making the whole thing a hike to get in and out of. She gave a scoot and a hop and got out before Jason could meet her on the other side. He came around and closed the door for her. "You should have waited for me. I'd get you down." His lips turned up. "Oh, I bet you would, perv," Julia teased as Sin and Kevin walked up. Kevin smirked. "I hear pervert. Must be Caldwell here." "Thanks for the support, Kev," Jason said sarcastically. He grinned, shrugging. "Welcome." Sin smiled at Julia, taking in the extra tufts and hoodie uniform. Cynthia had on her Ugg boots, stylish to most, ugly to Julia. "Well, I see you are consistent," Sin said in her droll way. "Don't start. I didn't want to suffer through any more unwanted clothing." Sin rolled her eyes. "I did see you barely making it through the ceremony. Couldn't you have faked it?" "Hell no. I didn't like any of the teachers, and after the Terrell thing," Julia trailed off and immediately felt terrible. They'd all been there too, and here she was bringing it up. "Sorry, guys," Julia mumbled, bowing her head a little and letting her long hair form a curtain to hide her expression. That had been beyond stupid. Julie could kick her own ass. Miss Sensitive. Jason put a finger underneath her chin, tilting it so their eyes met. "Don't be sorry, Jules. All of us were there too. It was me that killed him," he said in a low voice. "Ask me if I feel bad." Julia swallowed, her mouth suddenly dry. "Do you feel bad?" He shook his head. Solemn. "No." "Hell, Jules." Kevin spread his arms away from his body, wearing a t-shirt that read, zombie bait. You were in that psycho's crosshairs. Caldwell had to do it. Cynthia looked at Julie and understood. They'd been friends for years. She didn't want to feel responsible for any accidents, especially after her parents. Especially that. She reached out and put a chunk of her hair behind Jules' ear. Don't sweat that creeper, Jules. This wasn't your fault. Your fault that he died. Just because someone dies when you're around doesn't mean you have to take the death as your problem. That's crap, and you know it. Sin dipped down a little until she was eye level with Jules. Are you hearing me? Yeah, Julia whispered. She was so lucky to have these guys. Unshed tears burnt the back of her eyelids. Tears were for sissies. She'd sucked it up, hugging Sin with one arm and flung the other around Jason, her hand in the middle of his back. Is where she could reach him. He cuddled her as they did an awkward shamble to the bonfire that Kevin had built, the heat washing over her like a wave of comfort and serenity. Too brief. Her peace was too brief. Chapter 8. Seattle. Pierce and William had deemed her ready. Ready for travel. Ready for the final leg of their journey. They were headed to William's home coven in Seattle. Julia was ready too. She only had the smallest amount of guilt. After all, if Julia was truthful with herself, then she'd had to wallow in it. The memory. Explore it. Reconcile that it was not William and Pierce who'd killed Jason. That they'd been too late to stop it from happening. Julie would not let sentiment cloud her plan. The memory began to play out like the nightmare it was. Julia felt the heat begin at her toes and roar up her body like she was a lone tree in a forest on fire. Her heart was beating rapidly, her palms sweating, and her breath coming in great whoops. Julia had to calm down. Now, before she had a full-blown panic attack that always got the full attention of the vampire. Julia didn't want that. Ever again. She deliberately slowed her breathing, shoving the horrible memory down in the well of her subconscious. It would come again. It always did. In the silent and unguarded moments of her wakefulness, it would surge forward like the tide to shore. Julia waited until her hands had only a fine tremble, then picked up her bag. Turning, she looked one more time at her temporary home. She sighed. Closing the door behind her, Julia suddenly realized what day it was. Over a year since her precious Jason had been ripped from her life, torn from her soul, leaving it within her body, shredded. Julia moved down the hall, seeing the two runners who waited so still against the exit, waiting for her, their prize. But not for long, Julia thought, covering her smile with an effort. She moved forward and they fell into step beside her, leaving the house behind them forever. Imagine the logistics of traveling with vampires. If it hadn't been her reality, Julie would have thought it was funny as hell. But it wasn't funny. They had driven up the highway to the Anchorage airport, gotten on the plane, the red-eye flight taking on new meaning, and flown the lonely journey to Seattle. She had a small window of time in which to escape. They were already in the city where the coven was located. How to shake them before they arrived, especially when William's blood was still in her body, diluted, but there, like a pulse. It would be a navigation tool for him. Julia caressed her bag, the hair dye and change of clothes she had planned, hidden inside. She smiled. It might work, but only if Pierce was the one that was nearby. If it was William, all hope was lost. She had another lapse of guilt, thinking back to her conversation with William on the plane. William had looked at her, and Julia became interested in her hands. "You seem tense," he said as a statement. Pierce looked up at them sharply, then away. At least they hadn't insisted on sandwiching her in between the two of them. That would have been awful. Julia purposely loosened her tense hands and laid them flat on her thighs. That was all she needed, William detecting something was amiss. She met his eyes, the palest gray, striking against all that black hair. He gave a little smile, and she realized she'd been staring. Her palms dampened, and she resisted the urge to rub them on her pants. I am, she answered honestly, knowing it would ring of the truth. I mean, I've been with you for a year, and now I have to be with a bunch of... She looked around the tight confines of the first class section of the airplane she rode on. Of you, she finished in a whisper. William's eyes narrowed, and Julia didn't squirm. She wasn't one to just keel over because someone had an emotional moment. She could hack it. We have gone over this many times, Julia. They will welcome you. You shall be safe, protected. No more running. No more mystery. She nodded. Julia knew what he'd said. She even felt that William believed it. But she'd been there that day on the beach. She'd seen what it was. How they were with each other. Her. The where. She shuddered, thinking of something else. Anything else. William reached out and placed his hand over hers, and Julia let him. She'd learned early on that her resistance brought a barrage of questions and concern. It was better for her to pretend. It'd make escape easier. Turning her hand over, William rubbed a thumb over the pulse in her wrist, beating frantically like a trapped bird. His pupils dilated, and he licked his bottom lip as her breath came shorter, his eyes darkening, the gray beginning to disappear like imagined smoke. William, Pierce said in a low voice. William gazed across the aisle at him, brow furrowed. Pierce looked pointedly at the contact between them, and William removed his hand from hers, the lack of his touch leaving her disturbingly empty. What was wrong with her? It must be because of her nervousness with the execution of the plan. She had a stabbing pain for Jason in that moment. He'd have known what to do. But no more. Now it was up to her. Julia must be her own savior. William waited until he seemed to get control of himself, then said, "You will see. My home coven will be a place of respite." Fat chance, Julia thought. Before, she'd been too weak to think of escaping. Now, all that time that she had been bereft over the loss of Jason and the others was now at the forefront of her mind, pressing her forward into the unknown. Julia was in charge of her own destiny, not the vampires, not the werewolves. She, Julia, only her. Escape. They exited before the other passengers, only first class for vamps, she thought sourly. Julia had never flown first class before. Actually, she'd only been on a plane for a single trip, to fly from her home state where her parents had been executed on the highway. She gulped at the memory. Julia gave herself another mental push forward as the chaos of the airport swirled around them, the vampires tracking the people, the cattle. She turned to William, willing her pulse to slow. I need to change and use the restroom. She lied smoothly, her pulse sluggish. Why it was cooperating now, when in the plane it had been fluttering uncontrollably why he'd been touching her, Julia didn't know. Didn't care. She was that close to freedom. Julia wasn't blowing that chance for anything. Pierce waited and William ran his hand through his inky hair, making it spike. Turning that smoldering intensity to Julia, he said, "All right, but Pierce will need to stand guard outside of the bathroom until I can get our comrades here to escort you to the car." Comrades. Translation: vampire. Julia felt an eyebrow hike. Smart of him. William was going to leave her with good old Pierce while he got a few more of the vampire crew up here so the precious blood singer couldn't get away. Real circumspect guys. They thought they were so smart. Well, the element of surprise was the only thing Julia had, and she was using it. "Where am I going to go?" Julia pointed out. His eyes narrowed on her, and Julia held her breath. William seemed to really deliberate until Pierce broke the swollen moment. "Just go. I'll stand guard, and you will return with the additional runners." He rolled his broad shoulders into a dismissive shrug. William palmed his chin. "Fine." He turned to Pierce. "Be sharp. Be vigilant. Even now they may be about." Julia looked around, expecting gnomes, trolls, or both to pop up around her. "The werewolves," Pierce clarified in a low voice. True, there was them. Pierce took her elbow and Julia walked to the restroom with him. When she glanced over her shoulder, William's form was a speck down the choked corridor. Julia threw the bag on the bathroom floor stall, kicked off her flip-flops, and dragged out the skirt, boots, and shirt she had cropped the night before. It would bear some skin, but Julia had taken the jacket she had in her arm. She grabbed the box of black hair dye she'd taken from underneath the sink vanity. She rushed to the sink and began to chop off her long, ginger-colored hair to her shoulders. Another girl beside her leaned back and said, "What are you doing?" she asked, snapping gum, watching as the hair piled at Julia's feet in a heap of spun honey. Julia met her eyes in the reflection of the mirror. She asked, "What does it look like?" The girl's eyes narrowed. "Butchering your hair like a dumbass?" she stated logically. Julia smiled. She couldn't help it. Yeah, she was, but it was necessary. The girl took a hard look at Julia, then shaking her head, she walked away, giving Julia one last look that clearly said, "Crazy bitch." Yep, that was her all right. Julia guessed the plastic scissors didn't help with that. Can't get the real ones on the plane. She stopped at the sink and mixed the black dye. Lathering her hair, she watched as her almost blonde tendrils with a hint of red became a mass of black. It utterly changed how she looked. The boots made her 5'7" instead of 5'4". Julia was taller, wearing different clothes, and had black hair that was 18 inches shorter than when she'd entered the bathroom. She had the money she'd had on her the day that she was taken. Julia opened her palm and looked at the lonely $30.05 and 1 penny. She made a fist, and her hand stuffed the change back in the pocket of her skirt. She grabbed the toiletry bag like a purse and made her departure when there was a pair of women exiting the bathroom. Julia dipped her head and walked out, the hair still wet underneath, clinging to the nape of her neck like cool fingers. Julia kept her head down and her legs moving, heart racing, far beyond the effort she was expending. She had her toiletry bag clenched under her arm and kept moving. She was exiting security just as William and the runners were passing through. Julia could hear his his voice, and she didn't turn. But Julia swore she felt a hesitation in his speech, a scorching gaze that she did not see, but felt pass over her. And then Julia was outside in the drizzle, clouds making shapes across a full moon, 20 cabs in sight. Julia hailed the first one. Closing the door behind her, she said, "Get me to the closest bus depot." The cabbie turned around to look at her. "To where?" he asked, his voice accented, a turban situated on his head. Julia tried not to stare. "Away," she said cryptically. He huffed, slamming the flag that started the meter at $2. They pulled away from the curb, and Julia hazarded a look behind her. Julia's mind recoiled in terror as she saw William and Pierce, and beside them, 2 runners. Vampire. The noses high in the air, scenting it. Scenting for Julia.